illustrated their visions with mysterious magical displays, such as, for instance, the Indian rope trick.
The original version of the rope trick, or perhaps we could say the most complete version, that which is described by the Arab traveller Ibn Battuta in the 13th century, I think, a Moroccan traveller in China. He described the Indian rope trick, where the magician came forward along with a young boy apprentice and made a rope stand on end. He instructed the young boy to climb the rope. The young boy was, I think, unwilling to climb the rope, but was more or less bullied into it. When he gets to the top of the rope, he disappears. The magician calls the boy back. The boy doesn't come. The magician appears to get angry, and holding a knife between his teeth and muttering threats against the little boy, he climbs the rope, disappears from view, and the next thing Ibn Battuta and presumably the rest of the audience saw were the dismembered limbs of the boy dropping from the sky. First a leg, then an arm, then another leg and an arm and a torso and a head. And next, the magician appears at the top of the rope, descends it, covered in blood, with the bloody knife, picks up the separated bits of the boy, sticks them together in their appropriate conditions, snaps his fingers, and hey presto, the boy stands up, whole again, and the trick is over. Now, this is a spectacular trick in any sense of the word, but it is also a dramatic allegory of the kind of experiences to which the shaman is alluding in his own private encounters. We have the allusion to an ascent to another world via a rope, which in those days would almost certainly have been made of hemp. There is also the allusion to the experience of coming apart at the seams in the other world. This is the experience of dismemberment of the body. So the Indian rope trick is not just a showbiz performance, it is an in-depth allegory of the kinds of experiences which are esoterically associated with the shaman's law, and the shaman's law, particularly the Siberian and the North American and South American Indians, appear to be very closely associated with a variety of hallucinogens.
I was stared at, hooted at, grinned at, chattered at by monkeys, by parakeets, by cockatoos. I ran into pagodas and was fixed for centuries at the summit or in secret rooms. I was the idol, I was the priest, I was worshipped, I was sacrificed. I fled from the wrath of Brahma through all the forests of Asia. Vishnu hated me, Siva lay in wait for me. I came suddenly upon Isis and Osiris. I had done a deed, they said, which the ibis and the crocodile trembled at. Thousands of years I lived and was buried in stone coffins with mummies and sphinxes in narrow chambers at the heart of eternal pyramids. I was kissed with cancerous kisses by crocodiles and was laid confounded with all unutterable abortions amongst reeds and nilotic mud.
Do you still feel that drugs have no place in your life? No part, perhaps, in your proudest traditions? Are they still immersed in the cozy, convenient obscurity surrounding the horrors that are taken today? Well then, reflect on a little social history. Think of a country that consumed in 1 year, for recreational and largely bogus medicinal purposes, 60,000 pounds of opium, whose drug culture engulfed the peasant, professional and ruling classes, even trapped the king. Think, as they say, of England. George IV, Clive of India, William Wilberforce, Florence Nightingale, and almost every influential poet of the 19th century all fell to the curse of the poppy gum. Consider any popular alcoholic spirit, and you will see how wide the fruit of the Dreamflower spread. The choice of self-administered opium poison was almost endless. Raw gum, paregoric, laudanum, heroin for coughs, opium beer, Kendall Black Drop.
Batley's sedative solution, Obridge's lung tonic, which had opium in it at one stage, Dr. Collis Brown's chlorodyne, which was one of the patent medicines containing opiates. There were also a number of what were known as children's drafts or infants' quietners. There was the widespread and well-known Godfrey's cordial. There was Atkinson's infant's preservative. And also there were a variety of local children's quietners, which would be made up by the local pharmacist or by the local grocer.
Dr. Virginia Berridge, anthropologist.
People also had their own domestic recipes, often which had been handed down in families from one generation to the next, and which probably derived from the traditions of homemade opium preparations, of poppy head tea and so on, which had been commonplace in more rural times.
From sickly workers' children to old middle-class ladies, few were considered too frail or too refined to take a drop of the very hard stuff. Opium, it seems, simply wasn't a bother.
One of the things that struck me when I was interviewing some elderly pharmacists whose memories went back to dispensing the drug in the early decades of the present century was how normal they'd seen dispensing opium over the counter as being. In fact, many of them had trouble in remembering very much about it. They remembered that they'd actually been selling quite a lot of opium, but it hadn't seemed anything that was particularly out of the ordinary to them. So in a sense, I think that's also what was important about drug use in 19th and early 20th century society.
And all this in an age that held up moralistic values that still seem to tether our own. A culture of little sex and no rock and roll. So what did the great shamans of the last century, the doctors, make of all this? Were they entirely unaware of the dangers?
I think what's interesting about the 19th century is that there wasn't actually a conception of excessive drug use as a problem or as something that was seen of in terms of addiction. For instance, when William Wilberforce was becoming rather concerned about his consumption of opiates, Isaac Milner advised him not to worry about the habit of such medicines, that the habit of growling guts was infinitely worse. So I think that was quite a common contemporary attitude, that people might have been a bit concerned about excessive consumption as perhaps something which was a moral failing, a sign of moral weakness. But they certainly didn't see drug use as a social problem as we see it now.
Not the sort of history that an advocate of 19th century values would choose to brandish. Regrettably, however, those wonderful moral guardians, the Victorians, didn't stop at opium.
Cocaine was really first introduced in this country, or at least the coca leaf, the use of the coca leaf first became reasonably common in this country in the 1860s, 1870s, when samples of the leaf were brought over from South America. And there was, interestingly enough, a vogue for chewing the coca leaf and for coca wines in this country, so that one finds, for instance, Professor Christison, who was a professor at the University at Edinburgh, actually writing in medical journals at the time, advocating the benefits of chewing the coca leaf as an aid to mountain walking. And he himself, well into his 70s, went up several mountains in the Highlands chewing coca leaves to show that how this was an aid to exertion and to stamina. As far as cocaine went, that's the alkaloid derived from the coca leaf, cocaine first really came into medical practice in the 1870s, the 1880s, and for a time it was seen as a wonder drug. There were numerous reports in the medical journals at the time of the different uses to which cocaine could be put. There were virtually anything from as an anaesthetic, which of course it is a very effective anaesthetic, to an aid to keeping one's arms steady while out shooting. So I think that's perhaps an example of how a drug can be taken up really without much thought about longer term effects and uses by the medical profession.
Dr. Virginia Berridge, feeling a little uncomfortable. Those horrid drugs brushed away as curtly as was sex by the Victorians, coming a bit too close. Well, swallow hard, or rather don't swallow at all. For as Professor John Hawthorne of Glasgow University began to realise, we all take drugs that would horrify us 3 or 4 times a day.